All right, welcome everyone. This is a highly, highly requested interview. When I started doing interviews on my channel, I got multiple requests to have Tom Holland on. So I contacted Marvel Studios and they wouldn't get back to me. So I got an even better Tom Holland to join us, the historian Tom Holland. Tom, how are you doing today? Thanks for joining us.
Very well. I can't believe you made that joke.
Well, I think I have a right to, because I also share a name with a famous person. There was a rapper about 20 years ago named Mike Jones who had a one-hit wonder. And so every now and then I'm randomly like in a checkout line and someone hands someone my credit card and they're like, "Oh, Mike Jones." I'm like, "Oh God, here we go again."
But he's not Spider-Man, is he? I mean, it's not really
No.
comparable. And the Spider-Man joke was funny maybe the first 30,000 times, but it's
Yeah.
I hate
I get it. I get it. And you were first, so you got your name on
I was
books, and then he
first.
comes
Yes,
after.
exactly.
It's not fair at all. When I have quoted you on TikTok, I put some of like your quotes in some of my TikTok videos. I've had to actually put your picture. Yes, I've had to put your picture and then below, not Spider-Man Tom Holland, because people actually think I was quoting the actor.
Well, bless them.
Well, thanks for joining us. Tell us about yourself, your background, what you specialize in.
Well, as people could probably tell, I am British. So I'm sitting here in London. I am a writer. I focus on the history of antiquity and the early Middle Ages. I'm a translator. So I've translated Herodotus, the first great Greek historian. I've got a translation of Suetonius, the biographer of the 12 Caesars, out next year. I co-host a podcast called The Rest is History. What else can I say? I have a dinosaur sitting next to me, which is very exciting, which I bought in an auction. People can maybe see if I move my head. Oh God, I find this different. Yeah, maybe you can see in the background a mosasaur jaw. Can you see
Oh,
it?
yeah, I do see that. Yeah, that is interesting.
I hope that's a kind of adequate introduction.
Yeah, so here's a link to your podcast. The Rest is History. This is actually a very enjoyable podcast. I started listening to when you had one of my favorite historians on, Ronald Hutton. And
yes,
it was
yes,
very, very good podcast. I've listened to other episodes since then because I just like going into a lot of the historical aspects that you go into. So I encourage anyone, if you really want, if you're a history buff and you want to learn more about history, this is a great, great podcast to definitely go through for sure.
I see that someone has commented, says he's British, but last name is Holland. Again, a common error. Holland actually has nothing to do with Holland, as in the Netherlands. It comes from the Old English meaning high land, and apparently it's a hill in the Midlands, the middle of England. So that's where my ancestors came from. So
interesting. Well, my ancestors are Irish, Scottish, and Welsh, so I basically just hate myself.
Right? Yes, I'm sure you do. Like Biden.
Exactly.
He never talks about his ancestors from Sussex, I noticed.
Yeah. Well, this is the book we want to talk about because, of course, this was a quite a bombshell when you dropped it. I remember I saw you basically everywhere after this book came out. So that encouraged me to pick it up. I saw you get interviewed by Tim O'Neill on the channel History for Atheists, and I love his work. So anytime he tends to recommend a book, I tend to go out and try to get it. And so that's when I picked up your book, and it was phenomenal. Dominion, How the Christian Revolution Remade the World. So talk about what led you to write this book. What is it generally about? Just give us a good overview before we go into specifics.
Well, I mentioned how the books that I've written have been on classical themes. So I wrote a couple of books on the history of the fall of the Roman Republic. So that's the age of Julius Caesar and so on. And then the period of where Rome was ruled by Augustus and his dynasty up to the death of Nero. I also wrote about the Greek war against the Persians in the 5th century BC. And this was a reflection of the fact that as a child, these were my obsessions. I loved the Greeks. I loved the Romans. And although I read the Bible with great passion as well, I loved anything that was kind of ancient. I found that emotionally, and I'm appalled to say this, I was very much on the side of the kind of ancient superpowers. So I was very much with, pro Pharaoh, pro Nebuchadnezzar, pro Pontius Pilate. Um, and I kind of identified with Greece and Rome. And if you'd asked me where do my values come from, my ethics and so on, I would have said Greece and Rome. But I basically, the experience of writing about, say, Caesar, who when he conquered Gaul, slaughtered 1 million Gauls, it said, enslaved another 1 million, and everyone in Rome went, hurrah for that. That's great, fabulous. Or Sparta, Leonidas, the king who died at Thermopylae, hero of 300, if you've seen the film. I mean, the entire Spartan state was founded on the systematic exploitation of a conquered neighboring city, and actually provided the inspiration for what the Nazis did in occupied Eastern Europe. And so I began to question the degree to which actually these were, kind of morally speaking, ethically speaking, my ancestors, my progenitors. But it was more than that. It was also the experience of trying to write about these ancient peoples in English, a language that I began to realize was inadequate to express all kinds of concepts and casts of mind that the Greeks and the Romans had had. And when I kind of analyzed this more closely, I realized that again and again, the issue was basically Christianity, that Christianity had so kind of saturated the meaning of words in English that it was incredibly difficult often to use them and get back to a pre-Christian world. And so I became increasingly kind of interested in the degree to which things that I had rather taken for granted, things that I had assumed were essentially human nature or just the way that societies organize themselves, that actually they weren't at all, that they were culturally contingent, and the culture that they derived from was Christianity. And so I wrote Dominion essentially to explore that thesis and to see, essentially to stress test it, to see whether this kind of feeling I increasingly had, that so much that people in the West, and particularly perhaps those who would count themselves as agnostic or indeed positively hostile to religion and perhaps Christianity in particular, that actually even being opposed to Christianity has Christian roots. I mean, these were the kind of suspicions that I was coming to. And so I wrote Dominion basically to see whether those hunches were correct, whether that thesis could be elaborated, and whether the threads that I increasingly felt could be traced from antiquity right the way into the present, whether that was actually possible. And I'm delighted to report that I've discovered that you could. So otherwise I wouldn't have written the book.
Yeah, so I do want to talk about some specifics when you get into that. But I like how you sort of say at the end of your book, towards the end, I believe in the last chapter, you say secularism owes its existence to the medieval papacy. Humanism derives ultimately from the claims made in the Bible that humans are made in God's image, that the Son died equally for everyone, that there is neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female. Repeatedly, like a great earthquake, Christianity has sent reverberations across the world. And I mean, like a lot of us tended to feel like that was the case. Like you mentioned, that the ancient Romans and the Greeks were very different in how they looked at humans and values. And it was really nice to see that said by a historian. Like, that's kind of what we also thought. So this is why I really did enjoy the book, because it seemed like it was just so obvious from my layman understanding of history.
So writing the book, I had two contradictory emotions. One was, goodness, is this really the case? All my humanist friends are going to be very put out by all this, by this. And then there are other times where I thought, but this is obvious, isn't it? Isn't this what everybody thinks? And actually the reaction of people has been it is not what people think. Lots and lots of people think that, say, secularism or humanism or whatever are, have nothing to do with Christianity, indeed are often opposed to Christianity. So I think that there absolutely is a case to be made, that needs arguing. And I would go so far as to say that atheism, as it has expressed itself, certainly in Western countries over the past 200 years, is very, very Christian in its impulse. I would say that some, a figure like Richard Dawkins or Christopher Hitchens or Daniel Dennett, the horsemen of the apocalypse or whatever they were called, that these are actually very, very Christian figures. It's impossible to imagine them outside a Christian culture. And I'd go further and say actually a Protestant culture.
Yeah, I mean, I do see that. I do see a lot of modern day atheists talking in almost religious terms about
Yeah.
trying to enlighten people, bring people into the light. And
Yes.
after reading your book, I can totally see where their language is coming from. But I want to ask you this question: do historians, after you wrote the book, do they generally agree with your conclusions of the influence of Christianity has had on modern Western civilization? And are there any other similar books along the same thread, this same line of thinking?
That's a very good question. I mean, I think you'd have to ask them. I mean, I'm sure most haven't read it. So, but I had so the episode list of The Rest is History that you flashed up showed 3 episodes on what are misnamed the Cathars. And I was writing today to a historian called R.I. Moore, who wrote a book called The European Revolution, and then a book called The War on Heresy, about the Middle Ages, and specifically the way that heresy evolved and what it actually was. And I sent him the episodes, and he listened to them, and he wrote back and was very pleased, basically because I'd drawn heavily on his work. But he said, I'm going to go back and reread Dominion and consider whether I agree with you on the Enlightenment. So, so I don't think it's been 100% accepted, but equally, I don't think it's been 100% rejected.
Yeah, I've definitely seen that.
To have a historian of Bob Moore's stature say, I will go back and contemplate what you're arguing. I mean, that's wonderful.
Yeah. Oh yeah, that's absolutely a good endorsement. And again, anywhere I've seen this book and talked about by historians, it's generally like, this is phenomenal work. This is top tier history, which is why I've cited it numerous times. If and again, if Tim O'Neill in History for Atheists is going to recommend it, it's probably a good book in my view. So that's a good
I mean, he is an exacting critic.
Yes, exactly.
I don't think I've ever met anyone who tolerates fools less gladly.
Oh, you should see some TikTok stuff, but I digress.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk about some ways that Christianity has shaped Western values. What was the world like before Christianity? What values did the average person prize? And what did Christianity do that made people start to think differently? We can talk about that more generally, and then we can go into some specifics like about patriarchy and slavery. But what are some general ways that Christianity helped to shape values?
I think there's almost so when I began it, the obvious ones that people think are questions around morality and ethics, but I think that actually it's in the dimensions that you might be most tempted to think are kind of universal, and it turns out not to be at all. So the way that functioning of sexuality, the way that we understand sexuality, for instance, the way that traditionally in the West we have structured marriage, the way that we understand society. So you mentioned the notion of the secular at the head of the program. I think that it's very easy for people in the West to assume that the concept of there being something called the secular and there being things called religion are just kind of self-evident. It's like saying, there are trees and there are cows. It's just the way of the world, but it isn't at all. It's a very distinctive way of comprehending society and how it functions, that essentially had not been conceptualized before Christians in the West did it. And I think that you can see the strains that has imposed on non-Christian societies in the way that, say, it's operating in countries like India or Turkey. So, I mean, just to expand on that, the idea that the world can be divided into twin dimensions, what we call the secular and religion, this is something that the tiny acorn from which that oak tree grows is the famous story of Christ being asked, should we pay taxes to Caesar? And he asked for a coin, and he's given a coin, and then he says, whose head is this on the coin? And they say Caesar, and so he says, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and render unto God what is God's. But what gives it its peculiarly kind of philosophical heft is actually the fall of the empire in the West in the late 4th and 5th century. And the person who really channels that is the great father of the Latin Church, Augustine, who is asked by people hostile to Christianity who cleave to the old ways, the old gods. And they say, look, everything is going wrong. Everything's going tits up. Rome is imploding. The city's being sacked. Our provinces are falling to pieces. This is obviously because we have ceased to pay the gods the dues that they were owed. What the Romans called the religiones, the bonds that join them to the gods. So they could be sacrifices, they could be feast days, they could be the rituals that for centuries and centuries had governed the relationship of the Roman state to the dimension of the supernatural. And all of these have now been abandoned. And Augustine turns around and says, no, not at all. Because actually Rome isn't really very important. It has no divinely ordained function, has no divinely ordained role, because it is part of the fallen world. Everything that is on the fallen world is bound upon the dimension of the cyculum, by which he meant the span of living memory. So things are born, they live, and they die, and then they're swept away on the great currents of time, of the cyculum. And if that's true of individual human beings, then it's true of cities and it's true of empires. And that is why Rome as well will fall. And there is only one thing that can redeem humans in the fallen world, and that is the religio, the single religio, the single bond that joins man to the radiant eternity of heaven. And that religio, of course, is the church. It's only through the church that one can be saved. And that sets up in the Latin West this kind of crucial sense of a division, of there being these two dimensions. And what happens in the 11th century and through the High Middle Ages is that this becomes institutionalized and provides a kind of a focus for what R.I. Moore, who I just mentioned, the great historian of the Middle Ages, calls Europe's first revolution. And essentially that involves people in the commanding heights of the church, and particularly in Rome, saying that we have to baptize the whole of Christendom. We have to redeem the church in particular, which is providing this religio, this bond for the Christian people to heaven. It has to be washed clean of anything that smacks of the cyculum. And so that means earthly control by kings and emperors. They have to be humbled and humiliated. New institutions are constructed and evolve to provide legal frameworks that can structure the law of this revolutionary new institution. And these are universities. Shock troops are sent out to impose an understanding of this order at the point of the sword. This is what gives us crusades and religiously sanctioned violence. Those who oppose this are branded as heretics. And so you see that the medieval church and medieval Europe, which conventionally is seen as a kind of hidebound, reactionary period of Western history, is not at all. It's a vibrantly, often violently revolutionary movement, and it serves to institutionalize in the West in a way that nowhere else, no other civilization had ever done, the sense of there being these two dimensions. And going into the Reformation and into modernity, what in Latin are called the cyculum and religio come to be called, say, in English, the secular and the religious. And when, for instance, the British go to India and they look around them and they say, well, what is the religion of the Indians, or the Hindus, as they call them? And so they start to construct something called Hinduism, which is not a word in any Indian language. It's the British who invent the idea of there being something called Hinduism. And because English is used as the language of government and education in British India, it means that the Indian elites start to think like that as well. They absorb these understandings. And when the British leave and a republic is proclaimed in independent India, it's defined as a secular republic. And that idea of India being secular is something that is written into the constitution. But India today, that is a concept that is coming under increasing strain, because the BJP, led by Narendra Modi, the Prime Minister, they're committed to the notion of something that they call Hindutva, the idea that Hinduism isn't a religion in the way that people in the Christian West understand it. There isn't even something called Hinduism. There is simply the primordial way of being Indian. And it's something that joins the supernatural and the natural, the heavenly and the earthly, the divine and the mortal in a kind of, it saturates the entirety of human existence. And that is an understanding that has no place for the Western concept of the secular. And so that's why the incredible strains in India at the moment. And you see something very similar in Turkey, where Ataturk, when the Ottoman Empire collapsed, he kind of adopted the idea that of laïcité from the French idea of secularism as being something neutral, but it's not neutral at all. It's a very, very Western idea that would, again, be unthinkable without this kind of lineage from Christianity. And so that's why, to symbolize his attack on this, President Erdogan of Turkey, turned Hagia Sophia, the great Byzantine cathedral, which had been turned by Ataturk into a museum as a kind of emblem of the supposed neutrality of the secular order that he was setting up. Erdogan has turned it back into a mosque, which it had become after the conquest of Constantinople. And so I think what people in the West are starting to wake up to is these notions of there being religions and the secular that we may be tempted to assume is just the way things are. Not so. These are very, very culturally contingent ways. And the more that Western power retreats, the more that we start to enter a culturally multipolar world. So the more I think we are going to, in the West, in the United States, in America, and in Western Europe, we're going to be brought home. It's going to be brought home to us the degree to which things that we took for granted are actually the product of our history, and specifically of Christian history, I think.
Yeah, that was beautifully put. I really appreciate you going into the details, the whole rise of secularism. Let's shift gears a little bit and talk about something else you talk in your book. I'm going to quote from one of my favorite quotes in the whole book. You talk about how Christianity really started to reshape the ancient family structure and step on the heels of patriarchy by allowing more romance and women to marry who they wanted. So you say priests were authorized to join couples without the knowledge of their parents or even their permission. It was consent, not coercion, that constituted the only proper foundation of a marriage. The church, by pledging itself to this conviction and putting into law, was treading on the toes of patriarchs everywhere. The rights of the individual were coming to trump those of the family. God's authority was being identified not with the venerable authority of the father to impose his will on his children, but with an altogether more subversive principle, freedom of choice. So let's expand upon this. You talk about secularism a little bit, but you also in your book talk about other ways Christianity influenced, like overturning old patriarchal norms, letting women choose who they wanted to marry, and bringing up this idea of freedom of choice. Can you go into more of that?
Well, again, I mean, it's complicated and it's deeply rooted, and it goes right the way back to the very beginnings of Christianity. And the earliest texts we have that are Christian are, of course, the letters of Paul. And when Paul writes to, say, the Corinthians, Corinth, although it's based in Greek, is a Roman colony. It's been founded there by Julius Caesar. So he's writing to people who are culturally Roman. And so all the stuff that he's writing about sexuality and about the organization of the family, whether he's writing to the Corinthians or whether he's writing to the Romans, he is having to factor in assumptions about sexuality and the family that Romans take for granted. And those assumptions are profoundly, profoundly different to assumptions that we have today. So the Romans, like most peoples in most periods of history, in most corners of the world, the familia is not what we would, it's not the nuclear family that is familiar to viewers of American sitcoms and so on. It is a much broader thing. It involves cousins, it involves uncles. It's essentially a clan. It's a familia in the kind of soprano sense, perhaps, if you want to put it like that. And in Rome, the head, the father, he is the head of a familia, and that means that he has powers of life and death over his children, but also over all his dependents, which would of course include slaves. And one of the expressions of this is how the Romans understand the sexual dynamic. So for us, the sexual dynamic is centered in gender, in the idea that there are two sexes. I mean, I know that it's slightly coming under threat at the moment. You'll know more than that than me, being on TikTok. But essentially, that is how we frame it. And for the Romans, this was not the case. So in Suetonius, the biography of the Caesars, Suetonius notes of Claudius, the Emperor Claudius, that he was only attracted to women, and he notes of the Emperor Galba, he was only attracted to men. And he notes this as a kind of interesting foible. It's not what defines them sexually. It's rather, as we would say, of a man, he's only attracted to blondes or he's only attracted to brunettes. It's interesting. It's something worth noting, but it's not. Whether you're attracted to brunettes or blondes isn't the kind of it's not the binary that governs how we understand sexuality. For the Romans, what governs their understanding of sexuality is whether you are a free citizen, and therefore you can do what you like to your dependents and to anyone else if they are not free, or whether you are someone who has to submit to the thrustings of the free citizen. And in that context, within the household, it doesn't matter whether you are an adult or a child, whether you are male or female, which orifice is being penetrated. I mean, it makes no difference really. The head of the household can do whatever he likes, and that to us seems unspeakably brutal. I mean, hideous. To us, it seems a kind of license for domestic rape. I mean, it is a license for domestic rape. You think of the Greek gods, the Roman gods. I mean, that's all they're doing, and it's a very, very different way of understanding the world. Sexual morality seems very alien and frightening to us, I think. Now, this is the world that Paul is writing to. These are the people who he is writing to in his letters, and essentially he is saying, say to a Roman householder who has decided to accept Christ, well, you can't go around raping the scullery maid anymore, because that's not acceptable. And if you have to have sex, then you have to model yourself on Christ and Christ's relationship to the church, which means, by extension, that you have to be monogamous, and that monogamous relationship has to be lifelong, because that is the model of Christ's relationship to the church. Christ doesn't go around divorcing the church so he can get, betraying the church by running off with someone else. That's unconscionable. And so that imposes on people who become Christian an unbelievably strict understanding of marriage. I mean, it's strict both by the standards of Romans, who are divorcing, always divorcing left, right, and center, and on Jews as well. They can have various wives. This idea that marriage should be monogamous, it should be lifelong, and that there should be no scope for it for the kind of family-based rape that had been part of Roman households. This takes a long time for Christian authorities, Christian leaders to impose on society, for understandable reasons, because revolutions in sexual assumptions are very, very hard to push through. And they're running counter to things that are pretty fundamental and basic to the way that men in particular tend to understand sexuality. The way that the church going into the Middle Ages tries to patrol this is to break the power of the patriarch, the clan leader, to do what he wants to with his children. So to marry off, a daughter to a cousin or whatever. And the reason for doing this is that if Christ has chosen to marry his church, then a man has to have, he has free will when it comes to choosing who he wants to marry. And likewise for the woman, the church chooses Christ. So a woman has to be free to choose a man. And so over the course of the Middle Ages, simultaneously, what the church is doing is imposing an understanding of what is permissible in law for people to marry. So that's why in English we have in-laws. Your father-in-law, your mother-in-law, they're in law because they have been licensed to be permissible by the standards of the church. It's not incestuous. church councils are obsessed with defining incest. At some points, it's kind of 7 degrees of separation. So really, really, very, very, very stern. And this breaks up the power of the clan. But more than that, it kind of brings in the notion of romantic love as something that should be the basis for a relationship. And in a way, the classic kind of illustration of what this means in practice is Romeo and Juliet. Even though Shakespeare is writing as a Protestant, he's setting it in Verona, which is a Catholic country. And you have the Montagues and the Capulets are the embodiments of the old Roman understanding of the familiar. Juliet has to marry who her father wants her to marry, but she's in love with Romeo. And so who is it that facilitates their marriage? It's the friar. And that is the fact that Shakespeare is a Protestant doesn't stop him from kind of recognizing that actually there's a kind of commonality between Catholic and Protestant countries, because all of them are the heir to this single understanding of what marriage and what love should be.
Yeah, I'm really glad you went into that, because I was just getting in a TikTok back and forth with a Muslim who was trying to argue that polygamy is permissible in Christianity, and I was like, no, it isn't. Like it.
No, it absolutely isn't. No, it really isn't. And Muslims in the Middle Ages are, I mean, they regard it as unbelievably weird. It's one of the things about Christians that they find very, very kind of weird and odd. And actually, the reason that Jews now tend to have kind of monogamous relationships, monogamous ideal of marriage, is it reflects the influence of Christianity over the course of the Middle Ages. So I think by about the 10th and 11th centuries, Jews living in Europe are starting to practice monogamy in the Christian way.
Interesting. Well, let's talk about another aspect. Speaking of Islam a little bit, you wrote in the book, in Morocco, missionaries from the British abolitionists continued to be swatted aside. This isn't a Muslim country. In 1844, the governor of an island off the Moroccan coast flatly informed one of them that any ban on slavery would be against our religion, which was Islam. You talk about how Christianity was really crucial for fighting and ending slavery. Go into more of that, because I hear a lot of atheists today arguing that Christianity is pro-slavery. And I'm like, well, not according to the history.
Well, notoriously, there is nothing in the Bible that specifically condemns slavery as an institution. Christians seem to have regarded slavery as being akin to hunger or poverty. It's part of the fabric of a fallen world. It's recognized as being an evil, but Eve shouldn't have picked the apple. It's the bottom line. Shouldn't have persuaded Adam to pick the apple. But even in antiquity, there are church fathers who start to think through the implications of the fact that crucifixion is the fate of a slave, paradigmatically, under Roman law. And so the fact that Christ chose to die that death must mean a kind of sense of identification with the slave. And in the 4th century, there's a bishop called Gregory of Nyssa, in Nyssa is a town in what's now Turkey, who kind of extrapolates from that perspective the kind of radical notion that perhaps slavery as an institution is against God's will, that it should be abolished. And he argues for this. And his brother, Basil, who's also a great saint, founder of what might rank perhaps as the first hospital, I mean, a man of unimpeachable charity and concern for the poor and the suffering. But he says no, because what would happen, if we free slaves, what would happen to them? They'd starve. He sees slavery as necessary in a fallen world as a way of providing sustenance for slaves. And so that kind of argument that's advanced by Gregory of Nyssa, that slavery as an institution should be abolished, isn't one that seems to occur to Christians in the first kind of centuries of Christianity's existence. And this, again and again, you see this with Christianity, that it's kind of like a depth charge, that it can take time for the reverberations to spill out from the initial kind of shock. And what happens what brings abolitionists in the 18th and 19th century to think that the Christian God wants slavery to be abolished is, I think, a confluence of two circumstances. The first is a radically Protestant understanding of how you should read Scripture. For Baptists, for Quakers, for the kind of the more radical margins of the Protestant Reformation, and particularly in the English-speaking countries, so Britain and the North American colonies and the Caribbean, where Baptists and Quakers tend to settle. They argue that it's not the words in the Bible that matter; it's how the Spirit inspires you to understand them. So unless the Spirit is upon you, unless He has, you've become born again with the Spirit, you cannot properly understand the Bible, and that opens up, obviously, for a kind of often, many cases, a kind of radical reinterpretation of what had traditionally been understood that Scripture was arguing. The other thing that happens is that the institution of slavery in the Caribbean and in North America becomes both industrialized and racialized. And the industrialization reflects the fact that Britain is becoming the first industrial nation and is just much better than any civilization in history before has been at extracting wealth out of raw material. And slaves are raw material, and they are brutalized in a way that even the Marquis de Sade finds impressive. So the Marquis de Sade writes that all the masters of slavery and torture and cruelty were ancient, except for the English settlers in the Caribbean. He says they really know how to exploit. And the other thing that happens is that slavery becomes racialized. And it's very, very difficult for Christians to argue that the racialized enslavement is biblically sanctioned. There are people who try, they quote Noah, the curse of Noah on Ham, but it's an enormous strain, and nobody can really believe it, because one of the most fundamental teachings of Christianity is that all human beings are born equally, are created equally in the image of God, and that if there is no Jew or Greek, as Paul says, then there is certainly no black or white. And this is something that the Christian slave owners struggle with. And so it's that start first. It's the Quakers, then it's kind of evangelical wings in the Episcopalian Church and so on. They start to read Scripture in the light of what they're seeing in the plantations, and saying that this is an abomination to God. And the scale of human suffering on the plantations and the fact that it is racialized brings them to an understanding of Scripture that God wants them to abolish slavery, and that slavery is a monstrous sin, and punishment will come unless reparation is made. And Protestants have the idea of this. Well, I mean, all Christians do, but Protestants in particular have the idea of the Spirit as a fire, a purgative fire. And that is what abolitionist movement seems like. It's like a great fire that once lit just blazes. And it blazes so powerfully that in 1814, when the British Foreign Secretary goes to Vienna to negotiate an end to the Napoleonic Wars, he has no choice but to demand that the slave trade be abolished to countries that are Catholic, that don't have this Protestant understanding. And so they have to construct an explanation and a justification for the abolition of slavery that draws on Catholic tradition, which they can do. There are these traditions. And so the Protestant and Catholic understanding of why slavery should be abolished is fused to create what essentially is the prototype of international law. And it's that enables British Royal Navy ships to impound, say, Portuguese or Spanish slave ships, even though the sailors of the Royal Navy are Protestant and the slavers on the Portuguese or Spanish ships are Catholic. What then happens when the Royal Navy tries to abolish the slave trade in Muslim countries? I mean, that again is a huge challenge, because essentially British power being naval power being what it is, and French power they are able to sign a treaty with the Ottoman Sultan that obliges the Ottoman Empire to start regulating the slave trade as well. And this imposes enormous strains on Muslim scholars, because slavery has always been perfectly legal under Muslim law. And the Muslim understanding of God's will, again, is very different to the Christian one, because it's rooted in, the Sunnah, the example of the Prophet, the Quran even, that this is written in a way that Christian law traditionally hasn't been. Christian law is written on the heart. You look into your heart, there it's written. Your conscience tells you what's right. That's not the case with Islam. But they essentially, the only way that they can square the demand to abolish the slave trade with their understanding of what Islam should properly be is basically to Protestantize Islam, which I think is what's happened over the past 200 years, that Islam has been Protestantized. Which is perhaps going off to a slight tangent. You asked me, I've been whittering on for minutes and minutes there, but the process by which it's indisputably Christianity that inspires the abolition of the slave trade, but it's complicated. It's not simply a matter of, it says in the Bible, abolish slave trade, because it doesn't say that in the Bible, and yet the inspiration for it is clearly coming from the matrix of Christian scripture and belief and understanding.
Yeah, I think that's very interesting, and I'm fine letting you talk, because I love the way you just sort of go, and it's very interesting.
Yeah, sorry,
go. No, it's perfectly fine.
That it's complicated, because the processes of history are complicated, and it's not a kind of, again, so much kind of reductive debate kind of revolves around, well, it says in the Bible this, no, it doesn't, it says this. That's almost irrelevant. It's not entirely irrelevant, but it's how those have been understood and how the understanding has evolved and mutated over the course of time that explains how and why things happen, I think.
So what do you think the world will be like? I mean, we're speculating now, but what do you think it would be like if Christianity never existed? Do you think we would have gotten to where we are in terms of technology? Do you think these values would have come about in other ways? I know we're speculating, but what do you think about that?
I think actually I was in India for much of January, and whenever I go to India, I always think this is a little bit a flavor of what the Roman Empire might have been like if it hadn't fallen and if Christianity had never come about, because people in India believe and worship in gods, that reach back to ancient history. But India is also the home to an unbelievably profound philosophical tradition, which perfectly and easily coexists with the worship of these ancient gods. So perhaps that's what the world of the Roman Empire would look, and perhaps Roman sailors would have crossed the Atlantic and set up an equivalent in North America. Who knows? I mean, the problem is with those kind of counterfactuals is that there are so many contingencies in operation that it becomes almost impossible to discuss without kind of spiraling off into science fiction. But I think that what is striking, comparing, say, the ancient Mediterranean to ancient India, is how completely the supernatural, the world of the ancient supernatural has vanished, has gone. No one worships these gods anymore. And even, the philosophy of Plato and Aristotle, they have structured Western thought to the degree that they were absorbed into Christian thinking. Whereas in India, that's not the case.
Yeah, I find that very interesting. I think I never thought about it, but I do think India would probably be a pretty good analog to what the world would have been like in the West had Christianity never risen, because you would still have the Roman pantheon and the paganism of the time, just evolved in a slightly different way to where we're at God now. But do you think a lot of the values that we have now, would they have been there? Do you think a lot of the old Roman norms would still have been around?
Well, I don't think there's anything inevitable about the Christian enshrinement of the idea that the last shall be first, which is a very, very radical recalibration of what seems normative to people. the idea that those who are strong and powerful are strong and powerful because that's the way things are. I mean, again, I was just reading today with reference to India that there's controversy in India at the moment about one of the great poetic renderings of the story of Rama, which is the kind of the great mythic epic in India. And there are all kinds of passages in that enshrine the value of Brahmins over untouchables. There are phrases like, even if a Brahmin is a crook, he's better than an untouchable who's a sage. And that seems shocking to our eyes because our eyes have been Christianized, and because our culture has at its heart this a God who suffers the most humiliating fate imaginable. And what having the crucifixion and resurrection at the heart of our culture means is that the cross for the Romans is an emblem of power. It's an emblem of their power to torture to death those slaves who rebel against them. But what the cross has come to mean for Christians, it's an emblem of the opposite. It's an emblem of the fact that the victim will triumph over the victimizer, the slave over the master, the tortured over the torturer. And it's the power of that story and that image that underpins that that gnomic phrase in the Gospels: the last shall be first, and indeed the first shall be last. And again, I talked about there being depth charges. That depth charge continues to reverberate into the present. So, why do Black Lives matter? Because historically in the United States, Black people were enslaved, they've been disadvantaged, and so the fact that they have been disadvantaged is what means that their lives matter. Or why are trans rights roiling countries of Christian heritage in a way that they're not roiling countries with other heritage? It's because trans campaigners make the case that trans people have historically been kind of persecuted or dumped upon, and that in a Christian culture gives them credit. To be a victim becomes a source of privilege.
Yeah, I like the way you put that. Being a victim becomes a source of privilege. That definitely is a very Christian idea in its past. So to moving on, we're going to get to super chats here in a minute. We got a bunch already, but I do want to let people know Tom Holland has another book coming out this year, Pax, War, Peace in the Roman Golden Age. It should be out in Britain in July and in the U.S. in October. Do you want to tell us what this book is about and how they can get a copy?
Yeah, so it's the third in what's currently a trilogy, but I hope in the long run will be an entire history of the Roman Empire.
That sounds amazing.
To its fall. So the first book, called Rubicon, is I mentioned, is the one about the fall of the Republic. Then dynasty, I should say, is the dynasty of Augustus. This takes a story on from the death of Nero up to the time of Hadrian. So it covers the era of the four emperors, when in a single year 4 emperors scrabble after power. It's got the sack of Jerusalem, the burning of the temple. It's got Pompeii, the destruction of Pompeii. It's got the building of the Colosseum, Trajan's conquests, and Hadrian, as in his wall. So lots of fun. And the Pax, Latin for peace, is ironic because there was peace, but it was a peace that was peace for the Romans was quite a kind of an aggressive concept, very much underpinned by violence. So some of the themes that I've been talking about today are kind of there. I want to portray the world of Rome before the coming of Christianity in all its, to our way of thinking, strangeness and slightly intimidating grandeur.
Excellent. All right, let's get to some super chats here. I just want to go through. So thank you, Remote Age, for the super sticker. Much appreciated. Same with Assassin 9000. Thank you for the super chat. Here's an interesting question for you, Tom. What are Tom's views about Islam and how Islam shaped the world?
So I wrote another book called In the Shadow of the Sword before I wrote Dominion. And that was an attempt to answer the question, to what extent was the caliphate, when it emerged in the 7th and 8th centuries, a successor to the Roman and the Persian empires that it had conquered, rather than a complete break? And the book ended up and indeed I did a film about it as well, got me into some trouble because I ended up arguing that the idea on which Islam is founded, that the Quran is given to an illiterate prophet in the depths of Arabia, to believe that, you have to believe that Muhammad was a prophet of God.
Mm-hmm.
And if you don't believe that, then you're not a Muslim. And if you're not a Muslim, then you have to come up with some other explanation. And it seems to me that Islam is very recognizably a product of late antiquity. So that the final stages of the ancient world, it bears the stamp of the caliphate, bears the stamp of both Persian and Roman imperialism, and Islam itself bears the stamp of this kind of great melting pot, this great petri dish of different religious traditions that is current in the Near East in the 6th and 7th centuries. So there are elements of Christianity, there are elements of rabbinical Judaism, there are elements of Zoroastrianism, there are elements of other more obscure faiths and traditions. But what happens with Islam is that the Arab conquests precede the emergence of Islam. Traditionally, the traditional understanding is that Islam is given to Muhammad, and this inspires Muslims to conquer a vast empire. I think it's the other way around. I think that Arabs take advantage of the chaos in the Roman and Persian worlds to establish the caliphate. And then because this is an age where nothing happens without the will of God, they fashion an understanding of how and why God has given them this great empire that over the course of a century or two comes to kind of evolve to become what today we would recognize as Islam. So it's simultaneously bred of the matrix of the Jewish, the Christian, the Roman, the Persian, while also being a very radical break.
Interesting. Next super chat here from Sentinel Apologetics. Thank you, Rob, for this. Thoughts on Scottish theologians Thomas Torres's views on how Reformation Europe played a critical role in the scientific methods development and its achievements by Western science because of it.
So first of all, I talked right at the beginning about how words in English, I think, are treacherous because we attempted to assume that they embody concepts and understandings, significations that are universal and constant. And I think science is an absolutely classic example of this. No word for science existed before the 19th century. I mean, it did, but it didn't have the meaning that it has for us today. So science in 19th century England, even in the middle of the 19th century, could mean the study of Aristotle. The idea of what it is today is basically what religion isn't. So in a sense, science is has over the course of the late 19th century into the 20th century came to mean a way of understanding the world that does not depend on revelation or a supernatural understanding of the functioning of the cosmos. So in that sense, it's impossible to imagine science without religion. And religion, in turn, in English, is a very Christian understanding. So effectively, it's impossible to have science without Christianity. So in that sense, I think science absolutely is bred of a specifically Christian culture. But I think that's not quite what the question means. Although I mean, I think that kind of digging down to us, well, what do we mean by science? Where does the word science come from is important. But I do think also there is a reason why by the 19th century in English, we're calling science emerges in a Christian context. And that's because what Christianity gives people is both a God who is all powerful, omnipotent, and therefore his power permeates the entire cosmos. There is nothing in the cosmos that is not governed by his power, by his authority. But at the same time, and this is where Christianity, for instance, differs from Islam, God in the Bible, in the Christian Bible, very clearly is willing to bind himself with a covenant. So there's the first covenant, the covenant that's signed with the children of Israel and with Abraham and then with Moses. But there's also the covenant that's written on the heart that Paul talks about, that's somehow tied up with the sacrifice of Christ on the cross. So in the Middle Ages, this becomes this question of what's going on with the crucifixion. Is there some kind of legal agreement that God has signed with the devil, perhaps, or what's going on there? And as the philosophers and thinkers in the universities in the Middle Ages ponder this, so at the same time, they kind of tease out the implications of the idea that God might bind himself to laws by saying, well, he's God, he can do whatever he likes. I mean, he can have miracles, whatever. But what that implies is that reason and the idea that there are laws that govern the universe that have been imposed by God and which sometimes God himself submits to, it should be possible, because we have reason as human beings created in the image of God, it should be possible for us to access that, to fathom these laws. And so through the Middle Ages, you start to get the idea that you could look at the heavens, you could look at animals, you could look at light, you could look at sound or whatever, and find their manifestations of God's laws and understand the laws. And that going into the early modern period, I mean, that's what Copernicus and Galileo are doing when they look at the cosmos. They have the assumption that there are laws that govern how planets operate or whatever, because that's what their understanding of God tells them. And this is absolutely highlighted by when the Jesuits go to China. China, incredibly sophisticated ancient civilization, has and its entire court system is founded on the idea that say if there are eclipses, the emperor has to do rituals that will appease the anger of the heavens. So the ability to forecast eclipses is obviously incredibly important, and scholars in China, using their understanding of the cosmos, have arrived at ways of doing that. But it turns out that the Christian way of doing that is much better. And so the Jesuits turn up and they're absolutely whizzes at working out when eclipses are going to be. And they end up being appointed to the Chinese court as the people who have to work out the eclipse. And what's very clear is that the only way that Chinese scholars can properly do this is by becoming Christian. So in other words, it's not enough to have a kind of abstract understanding of the laws. You have to buy into the whole kind of cosmological and theodicy, the whole framework of that, to understand properly what they're talking about. So I absolutely think that in that sense, it's absolutely no accident that what we today call science emerges in a Christian context.
That's very, very interesting. Very generous super chat. I wanted to get to this one. Thoughts on revisionist historians such as J. Smith and the level of veracity and historical claims of the standard narrative. I'm not sure what you mean, Jeff. I appreciate the super chat.
That might be Islam. I think about Islam.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that the traditional narrative of Islam is that there are elements of truth in it, and there are elements that are clearly fantastical.
Yes, yeah, I do appreciate the super chat for sure. Next one here. Do you think people before Christianity had a rigid moral systems, even if they were vastly different, or was right and wrong more of a subjective matter?
I think that every human culture has had moral systems. Everybody has a moral system. I think it's hardwired into the way that we comprehend the world. I would go so far as to say the Nazis had a moral system. The Nazis didn't think they were being evil. They didn't commit genocide and all the horrors they committed for the sake of being evil, for the fun of it, for the pleasure of it. They saw it as a duty because their understanding of race led them to the conclusion that this was the right thing to do for their race. It was a moral system. I mean, to us, it's the embodiment of evil, but it was moral. Communism is a moral system. Roman sexuality was governed by a moral system. There is no agglomeration of customs and attitudes and assumption that is not governed, I think, by moral dictates.
Interesting. So we're at about an hour.
But we in the West, we take for granted, I think, by and large, that our moral system is best.
Of course,
because essentially it's a Christian moral system, and we're the product of centuries and often thousands of years of Christian conditioning.
So we're at about an hour here. I said we'd go for about an hour. Do you have time to finish a couple more of these super chats?
Sure.
Or do you need to
a couple more questions.
Sure. Okay. So we're going to cut off super chats now. Any more coming after this point, we're not going to answer. Katie, thank you for the super chat. Here's an interesting question. You don't have to necessarily answer it because it's out of your wheelhouse, but do you agree with Bart Ehrman that miracles such as the resurrection cannot be demonstrated by using the historical methodology?
I actually, just for Christmas on The Rest is History, we did 2 podcasts on Jesus as a subject of historical inquiry. So we had Jesus the mystery and Jesus the history. And of course, we discussed this very issue, and I think there are 2 issues from the point of view of historian. The first is that the methodology of history, as it has been practiced in the West since the Enlightenment, and to a degree, but beyond that as well, is to discount the supernatural as an explanation for events that happen in history, because potentially by explaining everything, it ends up explaining nothing. However, that does not mean that you discount the possibility, indeed the likelihood, that people back in historical times believed that supernatural events had happened, and that the impact of that belief can be measured. And I would say that it is impossible to make sense of the rise of Christianity if Christ's followers had not believed that he had indeed risen from the dead. And why they might have thought that he had risen from the dead is, I think, a mystery that defies the ability of historians to explain. It's not a historian's responsibility. It's kind of not within a historian's frames of, it's not what he's about. That's for theologians, it's for apologists, it's for priests, it's for believers to discuss. Which isn't to say that there aren't Christians who are historians, but by and large, if they're writing as historians, they won't explain the rise of Christianity as being expressive of the fact that Christ rose from the dead. But they can absolutely say it's expressive of the fact that the first Christians believed that Christ had risen from the dead. And it's perfectly legitimate to say we cannot know why they thought that. They just clearly did, and leave it at that. And I would say that we've been talking about Islam as well. I think there's an analogous mystery in Islam, because although the history, the biography of Muhammad and the traditional explanations for how the Quran came into being are late, and I think clearly unlikely to be historical, what is clear when you look at the sources for the reception of the Quran is that at no point is there any suggestion that these Quranic verses were viewed as anything other than the word of God. So again, there seems to have been something about the Quran from the beginning that persuaded those who became Muslim that it was indeed a divine revelation. I think you have to accept that that's what they thought, because otherwise it's very hard to understand how and why Islam spread in the way that it did. Exactly the same way that I think that historians have to accept that there is something very, very strange going on in the early hours, days, weeks, months of the Christian period.
Interesting. Let's move on. Do you think it's possible for a secular society to adopt Christian moral values, but not the religion and still maintain those values? Or will it devolve back to Roman standards?
Well, this is the great question that Friedrich Nietzsche, the German philosopher, famously asked. And I think it's fair to say that, the the jury's still out on that. So on the question, will it devolve back to Roman standards? I mean, a positive answer to that might be in the 60s, there was a great repudiation of Christian sexual standards. 60s was all about sexual liberation, the idea that the pre-Christian world had been like Pepperland, and that St. Paul had been like a blue meanie, kind of wagging his finger, ruining it, spoiling the party. And if people only kind of got over their Christian hang-ups and just let it all hang out, free love, everything would be great. The corollary of that has been, I think, that powerful men have come to feel licensed to exploit their inferiors in a way that would have been very familiar to a Roman. So what nobody asked when Harvey Weinstein, when that case broke and when he went on trial, was to say, well, what was so wrong with what he did? Nobody would have said that. Everyone accepted that what he was doing was wrong. And I think that implies that actually we're not ready to kind of to return to a Roman sexual morality. Mm-hmm. And the weird thing was that, again, I say this in Dominion, that the Harvey Weinstein thing coincided with protests against Trump and with the women's marches throughout cities in America, the whole Me Too movement. And one of the most popular costumes worn by protesters on those marches were the red robes and the white headdresses of handmaids from the TV adaptation of Margaret Atwood's Handmaid's Tale, which portrayed a kind of nightmarish vision of a Puritan New England kind of reborn in the 21st century. So it was a kind of satire on Puritanism. But essentially, what they were demanding was that men behave like Puritans, that they rein in their sexual desires, that they accept that a woman's body is sacrosanct, has an inherent integrity and holiness. So I think that kind of beautifully illustrates the tensions and the ambivalences that arise when you hold on to Christian values while feeling that you are consciously repudiating Christianity itself. I think it throws up all kinds of anomalies and malfunctions and glitches in the system.
Absolutely. I fully agree with you on that. Here's a personal question. Again, you don't have to answer. Is Tom Holland a theist?
Do I believe in God? Well, I would say I'm much more of a Christian than a theist. I've come to recognize that I'm pretty much completely Christian in my values and my assumptions. The problem I have is believing that there's a God. That's which does seem a bit of a deal breaker if you're a Christian. And that's a problem that I've had since I was a child. And you can see the mosasaur behind me. I was obsessed by dinosaurs and prehistory, and I worried about how God fitted into that. There are times where I do believe in God. So, if I'm in thin places, people say, don't they, where I think it's a kind of a concept, perhaps particularly in Celtic Christianity, the idea that there are places where God seems especially close, or times of the year, say Christmas or Easter, I can believe it. But there are other times where I don't at all. And so I have no firm anchoring with that. Sometimes I believe, most times I don't. I'd like to believe.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, all for that. Just wanted to put that out there because it was a super chat. On preaching the weird stuff, have you encountered weird Christianity or seen it preached recently? Not sure what you mean by weird, but maybe you do, Tom.
Oh, because this is because I'm very impatient with churches that assume that the way to preach the message is to make it indistinguishable from what everyone else is saying. And this was kind of channeled for me during the pandemic, when whether it was the same in America, I don't know, but in Britain, a lot of the churches basically focused on giving public health messages, kind of telling us to wear masks and wash our hands and stuff. Excellent messages, no doubt, but everyone else was saying that as well. And I think that that churches should celebrate what sets them apart. The problem for churches basically is that they've won. So all the things that seemed radical and strange and bizarre to the Romans is now accepted. And a lot of what the church has traditionally provided, education, healthcare, or so on, charity relief, have been nationalized. The state provides that. So what is left for the churches to do? And I think what the churches should do is absolutely celebrate all the kind of mad, weird stuff that, that you're not getting from departments of health. So angels and God thundering from Mount Sinai and all that kind of thing. Book of Job, all that stuff. I thought the weirdest thing, in the sense of it sent shivers down my spine and opened up vistas of possibility, was the one exception that proves the rule in terms of churches not making sense of the horrors that the world was going through during the pandemic, which was quite early in the lockdown in Rome. The Pope, I can't remember what he was doing. It can't have been a mass. It was some observance in St. Peter's Square, and it was completely empty, just him in St. Peter's Square. And he made prayers and did whatever he was doing. And as he was doing it, bells were clanging out over Rome, and the wailing of ambulances taking the sick to hospitals. And he went and prayed before an icon that tradition says had been sent from Constantinople in the reign of Gregory the Great, an icon of Christ, the infant Christ and the Virgin. And Gregory the Great, who was Pope in the 6th century, had become Pope during a period of plague. And his papacy existed in the context of the kind of suffering that we were going through. And he wrote a great commentary on Job, the book of Job, which is perhaps the profoundest, most troubling, and for that reason, I think, most satisfying attempt in the Bible to explain how a good God can permit evil to happen. I mean, it doesn't give an answer, but it kind of transcends perhaps the need to have an answer for that. And watching that gave me a sense of the unbelievable wealth of the Christian attempt to explain why we are here. Christianity is the most successful explanation that humanity has ever come up with to explain why we're here, and why bad things happen, and why good things happen, and the whole nexus of it. And that is an unbelievable reservoir for us to draw on. And I felt that very, very strongly writing Dominion. Kind of my eyes were opened up to the incredible riches in this tradition. And I think that is part of the weirdness. Moments that enable you to feel that you're not just you in 2023, that you're part of the totality of the human experience that is perhaps embraced within the mind of God. I mean, it's a very, very profound feeling, I think.
Perfect soundbite right there. Loved it. So you talked about this a little bit earlier. If you want to touch on it more, you can. Is Islam influenced by our faith, and that's why they are trying to show their faith is peace and tolerant, when in fact it isn't? Interesting thoughts on that super chat, if you have any.
Well, I mean, Christianity has I mean, it's been unbelievably intolerant in its time. You'll see the last 3 episodes on the Rest is History podcast. is about the Albigensian Crusade, which was launched against the Cathars, and blood spilled everywhere. I think that both Christianity and Islam are universal faiths. Both Christians and Muslims feel that their understanding of God is for the whole of humanity, and therefore needs to be spread to the limits of the world for the world's own good. And obviously that creates tensions with those people who might not feel the same. And I think that's evident right from the very beginning of Christianity. So, going again back to Paul's comment, there's no Jew or Greek. The problem, as Paul himself discovers, is that lots of Jews didn't want to lose their distinctiveness. They wanted to remain Jewish. And which is why the relationship of Christianity to the Jews has always been, it's the oldest, kind of darkest strand in Christian history. And the construction of an order in which free, liberty to believe and what you want has been long and arduous, rather in the way that the road to the abolition of slavery has been. It's been a long and winding road. For Islam, it's slightly different, because Islam, unlike Christianity, the Gospels, Paul's letters, the foundational texts of the New Testament, are not aware that something called Christendom is going to emerge, in which there are going to be categories of people called Jews and Muslims and Hindus and whatever. So that's the problem. The Quran is, whoever writes the Quran is aware of it. He's aware that there are Jews. He's aware that there are Christians. He's aware that there are pagans. And the Quran prescribes and mandates how these people should be treated, that pagans should not be tolerated, but the Jews and Christians should be tolerated, provided they acknowledge their own inferiority, pay a tax. Would you rather be a Jew in the Middle Ages in Christendom or in the lands of Islam? I think I'd rather be a Jew in the lands of Islam, because at least there I'm legally mandated. In Christendom, the rules keep changing because there aren't any rules.
Yeah, I think that's a fair response. Thanks to both of you for getting truth and reason out there, so rare on the internet and in the world today. Thank you, Paul, for the super chat. Here is another one. I am a Christian. I agree that welfare and healthcare were reformed by it. What about Jupiter being caring to the poor, or Roman welfare laws? What makes those different?
Jupiter didn't care for the poor. He didn't give a stuff about the poor.
Yeah,
he couldn't care less about them. There was grain was provided by the emperor to Roman citizens, but that was basically because if he didn't, the whole city would explode. It was a due of citizenship. It wasn't a kind of universal mandate. It wasn't because he felt that the poor should be fed. It was because as citizens, it was felt that it came to be accepted that they had the right to the grain dole, but it didn't imply any broader moral responsibility than that.
Interesting. So final few questions here. Thank you for the super chat. How revolutionary were the Crusades, and what are their legacy?
The Crusades are revolutionary to the degree that they're expression of this first revolution that I was talking about, this revolutionary moment in the 11th century when radical reformers set medieval Christendom on a wholly new path. And the Crusades are the kind of armed expression of that. And you see it again and again in similar revolutionary periods. So the religious wars that characterized the age of the Reformation, the revolutionary wars that characterized the age of the French Revolution, the wars that characterized the Russian Revolution. It seems very difficult to have these kind of totalizing revolutions without violence, and the Crusades, in that sense, kind of blazed the path.
A related book, they doesn't really cover the Crusades. If you're interested, Alex, Myth of Religious Violence by William Cavanaugh is a good book that kind of talks about religion and violence and wars. And I've always seen it recommended whenever I talk to various historians in the past. Last question. Do you think without Christianity, people would have come up with other systems, beliefs to fill in the steps of progress Christianity solved, or would we be behind?
I think the idea of progress is a basically Christian one. So if
Yeah.
Christianity didn't exist, we wouldn't have progress, and so we wouldn't worry about it.
Yeah, I think you're right. I was actually just reading understandings of time in the ancient world, and they had a more cyclical view of
Yes,
time in the
yes,
ancient Near East. They
absolutely,
didn't
yes,
look at time as like linear progress, but these constant cycles of repeat from the past.
yeah. As you still get in Asian religions.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll be doing a video on that in May, just if anyone's interested. All right. Well, I really do appreciate you coming on, Tom. This was again highly anticipated interview that a lot of people wanted. Get Tom's amazing book, Dominion. Again, read it, absorb it. It's really changed my outlook in a lot of ways. And also, you can check out his podcast, The Rest is History. Again, very fun and interesting podcast if you're a history buff. A lot of really cool stuff in here. So
Quite
definitely check
a lot
that out.
quite a lot on Christian themes. So I mentioned the 2 programs on Jesus. There's also one on crucifixion. A lot about Christianity on the podcast.
Absolutely, yeah. So, all right, thanks everybody for coming. Thanks again for joining us, Tom. I
Pleasure.
do really appreciate it. Yeah,
Absolute
a
pleasure. And thanks everyone for joining. Bye bye.
Yes. Bye bye. Thanks everybody.